almost 2 years of war in the center of Europe, almost 2 years of unity and cohesion of the civilized world, the USA, the EU and other democratic countries have probably never been so united as after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What aid can Ukraine still count on? Who announced an increase in support and what statements were made at the G7 meeting in Tokyo? More on that later in this episode. Meet Karolina Ashion.
The war continues, and it is not clear how long it will take to win justice and European values. However, the countries that stand guard over the good are forming at the mouth. They will stand side by side with Ukraine for as long as it takes. What aid can Ukraine still count on? Who announced an increase in support, and what statements were made at the G7 meeting in Tokyo? More on that later in this episode. 2 days of intensive negotiation, a meeting of the G7 countries at the level of foreign ministers took place in Tokyo. Israel and Ukraine became the main topics. Diplomats from the world's leading countries have called for immediate action to help civilians who find themselves in a dire situation in Gaza, including the halt to hostilities to provide aid and evacuate people. The G7 statement tried to find a balance between the need to help the Palestinians and support for Israel's right to self-defense. One way or another, the Group of Seven calls for a humanitarian pause. The G7 meeting was in part an attempt to contain the escalation of the humanitarian crisis, as well as to refrain from deep and wider differences over Gaza. The summit took place at a very tense time for countries and for the world, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in the comments to reporters, adding that G7 unity is stronger and more important than ever.
Our first focus here in Tokyo was the crisis in the Middle East. The G7 ministers reaffirmed our staunch support for Israel's right and obligation to defend itself and seek to ensure the attacks of October 7th can never happen again in accordance with international humanitarian law. We had in-depth discussions about the steps that we are taking to address urgent needs on the ground. We all agreed that humanitarian pauses would advance key objectives: to protect Palestinian civilians, to increase the sustained flow of humanitarian assistance, to allow our citizens and foreign nationals to exit, and to facilitate the release of hostages.
The ministers noted that the G7 is working intensively to prevent further escalation and wider spread of the conflict, and is using sanctions and other measures to deprive Hamas of the ability to raise and use funds to commit atrocities. They also condemned the increasing levels of extremist settler violence against Palestinians, which they said was unacceptable, undermining security in the West Bank and threatening the prospects for lasting peace.
As a result of talks, we as the G7 have firmly condemned any terrorist attacks by Hamas and others, and firmly confirmed the need for urgent response to deal with humanitarian crisis in Gaza, particularly the importance of humanitarian pauses and humanitarian corridor for humanitarian aid. At the same time, we have affirmed to work on a sustainable, long-term solution for Gaza, and the only pathway to just and lasting peace is the two-state solution. It is a significant achievement that we, as the G7, put together the joint statement regarding this issue for the first time, in terms of the G7 playing a responsible role in the international community, as well as Japan playing its role to host this year's G7.
According to estimates by Gaza health officials, about 10,000 Palestinians died as a result of the bombing during the months of hostilities. And according to UN data, almost two-thirds of Gaza's 2.3 million residents are internally displaced persons. The United Nations says the health, sanitation, water and food situation in Gaza is approaching a critical point.
A complete halt of all sewage pumps, which led to the overflow of sewage in the streets and neighborhoods, creating a health and environmental abomination and the spread of diseases. We are now witnessing a deterioration in the environmental situation resulting from the accumulation of waste in the streets, alleys, and all neighborhoods, and the spread of diseases and epidemics of all kinds.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Israel should not reoccupy Gaza, but added that Israel could control the territory during the transition period. When Hamas is completely destroyed, there will be a need for a certain transition period, Blinken believes.
I think we've been very clear from day one that when it comes to post-conflict governance in Gaza, a few things are clear and necessary. One, Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. That simply invites a repetition of October 7th, and Gaza used as a place from which to launch terrorist attacks. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza. Now, the reality is that there may be a need for some transition period at the end of the conflict, but it is imperative that the Palestinian people be central to governance in Gaza and in the West Bank as well, and that again we don't see a reoccupation. And what I've heard from Israeli leaders is that they have no intent to reoccupy Gaza and retake control of Gaza. So the only question is there some transition period that might be necessary, and what might be the mechanisms that you could put in place for that to make sure that there is security. But we're very clear on no reoccupation, just as we're very clear on no displacement of the Palestinian population.
The most desirable outcome would be a transition to a peaceful Palestinian leadership, Foreign Affairs Minister James Cleverly emphasized.
This is a difficult, a fragile set of circumstances. It is impossible for any of us to predict exactly what will happen, but we will continue to push for what we believe to be the best course of action in the here and now, which is humanitarian pause to facilitate humanitarian aid for the evacuation of hostages and foreign nationals from Gaza, as part of what we hope is a step towards our ultimate goal, which is that peaceful, stable two-state solution.
Neither Blinken nor Cleverly gave a time frame for this transition period or the conditions that must be met before Israel withdraws its troops from the Gaza Strip. But establishing a Palestinian leadership that Israel would consider peaceful in practice may be a long-term issue, experts say. Israel is not at war with the Gaza Strip. Israel is at war with Hamas, the IDF spokesman emphasized once again the other day. She said that ground operations are now taking place on the territory of Gaza Strip, mostly in the south. Israeli infantry, armored units, engineered troops are fighting. They're seeking out and eliminate Hamas tunnels, as well as demining. In an interview with one of the TV channels, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that his country is forced to win this war because there is no other choice.
We will win this war because we have no other choice. There's no life for us, there's no future for us and our neighbors if we allow the axis of terror led by Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and their minions to dominate. We have an alliance for peace on the other side. It includes Israel, the United States, the moderate Arab states, and the rest of the civilized world.
How many civilian deaths are you willing to bear in order to achieve your ultimate goal of eradicating Hamas?
If I had my way, no civilians would be killed. If Israel had its way and our calls would be heeded, they'll all be out of harm's way. And in fact, I'm saying this luckily now, and fortunately, hundreds of thousands have moved out of harm's way, heeding our calls and overcoming Hamas's threats at them at gunpoint not to leave the zone.
Do you know how many?
And now it's time to talk with my guest. Please welcome. And I'm ready and I'm pleased to introduce you to my first guest. This is Ilya Aizenstat, activist of Israeli Friends of Ukraine organization. Ilya, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting once more.
So my first question, a few days ago, we all know Israel launched the ground operation. The goal is to eliminate the basis infrastructure of Hamas in Gaza City. What is the current situation in the Gaza Strip? Has the most challenging stage the entry of Israeli troops into local buildings began? And what consequences can this all lead to?
As you mentioned already, it's a very complicated stage. The entry to the very overcrowded places, which now are almost empty, due to the multiple efforts of the Israeli forces, because they try to help to evacuate as many civilians as it's possible, because basically. When we're talking about hostages in Gaza Strip, we have to understand that there are not only Israeli and foreign hostages in the captivity of Hamas, but there are like hundreds of civilians which are against Hamas probably, and they're kept as hostages as a human shield as well in Gaza City and in all of the refugee camps around the Gaza City, which actually separate cities as well. So basically, after Hamas attack, they were, let's say, inviting IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, into Gaza for rapid attack on the Gaza Strip, and Hamas was prepared for it. All of the tunnels were prepared. There were munitions ready for this, like, very fast attack of the Israeli army. But due to the previous experience, the IDF commanders decided to prepare as much as they can for the ground operation in order to save the soldiers and civilians in the Gaza Strip. Because the main idea is to definitely eliminate the infrastructure of terror of Hamas in Gaza and to save all of the hostages. So basically, a lot of journalists and analytics were afraid that the Israeli army will suffer and will have a lot of casualties among soldiers and officers due to the fact that they will have to fight in the very dense area, in a very crowded area in the cities. But what we've seen now, after on the 43rd probably day of the war, after for a couple of weeks, Israeli army is operating inside of the Gaza Strip and the Gaza City exactly. The casualties among the Israeli forces are 48 people. It's not only soldiers, but also commanders in the ranks of major colonels, lieutenant colonels, and others. So, and these are incomparable casualties to the number of Hamas terrorists killed in tunnels and in their bases. Basically, the Israeli army separated the Gaza Strip for two parts, northern and southern. Northern part is now an area of the ground operation. They separated from the bottom and from the top, and then they separated also from the seaside. All of the operation is very complicated and based on the cooperation between the air forces, ground forces, armed troops, and intelligence. So basically, what we know about the Israeli troops movement, we know that when they're moving inside the very hostile environment, when they're surrounded by the terrorists, there are like circle of fire around them, which is created by the artillery and the air forces, which are using precise weapon to attack those terror units that are fighting with the IDF. And what do we know? That Israeli intelligence is very precise and that helped to save one of the hostages, a military girl that was captured on the 7th of October by Hamas, and she was freed in the very first days of the ground operation. Also, during the ground operation, Israeli forces finds a lot of different evidences, including the remains of the Shani Luke, the German-Israeli girl that was kidnapped and showed through all of the TV channels. She was brutally murdered in the Gaza Strip. Also, they found a lot of evidences of the babies kept in the one of the hospitals in Gaza Strip, which was also a very complicated target to operate with for Israeli forces. Because Hamas, as I already mentioned, they're using their own people as a human shield, and they're not operating like an army. They're using hospitals as their headquarters, and their military bases, because most of the hospitals have a very equipped and well-built bunkers above them, which are used for keeping hostages and for other military purposes. And we've seen the video made by the press secretary, the spokesperson of the Israeli army, Daniel Agari, who have made a trip for journalists from all over the world showing what is above the Rantisi hospital. And there were evidence that there were special places prepared for hostages. So this is exactly the very complicated part of the operation, operating with the hospitals, with the very, very crowded places and like very density places where a lot of buildings are built wall to wall. So it means that the Israeli army cannot operate very fast, and they cannot operate freely like in the open field when they have everything very clear. On the other hand, we have the southern part of the Gaza Strip, which is now became a very, very big refugee camp for those who managed to escape from the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and which is not so actively targeted by the Israeli army due to the fact that there are like hundreds or more than 1 million of civilians moved there from the north of Gaza Strip. And probably part of the hostages were transferred from the northern part of the Gaza Strip, where now army is operating, to the southern part in order to hide them under the UN schools and hospitals, among the crowded places with hundreds and thousands of civilians. So I believe that this is like what we have for now is very complicated, and what we'll have in a couple of weeks will be overcomplicated. So the most difficult times for Israeli specialists to operate in Gaza are only in the future. We'll see it just in a couple of weeks, probably.
Yeah. Let's imagine that everything is finished, but it seems that no one has an answer to the question what to do with Gaza. So what to do with Gaza? I ask you.
So I don't have an answer to this question. It's a very complicated. We know that Gaza was occupied by Egypt for a number of years. And we know that there were some proposals of the Israeli authorities that were leaked to the media that they proposed to Egypt to get over to Gaza once again, or help to move people from Gaza Strip to the Sinai Peninsula. But these rumors were, or there's not a rumors, but this proposal was declined by Egypt. There are some ideas of some international forces that will come to Gaza to operate the civil life in the Strip. There is also an idea of again bringing back their Palestinian authorities from the West Bank in order to restore their power in Gaza Strip, which was lost by them in 2007 after Hamas won the democratic elections in the Gaza Strip. But what I've seen through the decades, I'm pretty sure that in any other case, if there will not be any military control inside the Gaza Strip, the threat from the Gaza Strip will be once more up to date, and we'll see it once more rocket flying from Gaza to Ashkelon, Ashdod, or any other cities in the central or even northern Israel. Because since 2005, when Israel left Gaza totally, there were no Jewish villages or kibbutzim or any military presence in Gaza Strip. The only thing that did Hamas and the local authorities was investment in the luxury life of the Hamas leaders and the development of the infrastructure of the terror, which basically lead the people of Gaza to poverty. And I've seen a number of videos filmed by GoPro like before the war, and the Gaza Strip looked very, very poor, despite the fact that more than $40 billion were transferred to Gaza Strip since the mid-90s. And compared to the prices of Palma Jumeirah and other things done in the Arabic world, they could prepare a beautiful piece out of the Gaza. Because for decades, Gaza was known for its beautiful strawberries, for the clothes made there from the ancient times. And people had this possibility to develop agriculture there, fishing, but despite the they had all of the let's say independence inside Gaza. They did not build any infrastructure for making business or international relations with someone, because they elected Hamas, which is a well-known terror organization, which killed dozens of Israelis and foreigners, not only in Israel. Actually, the Hamas came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was originally invented in Egypt, like more than 50 years ago, more than 70 probably years ago. And what Egypt authorities did to the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, they executed most of them and expelled them out of the country. And that shows the exact how Egypt feels regarding the Hamas or Gaza population, because even in the Arabic world, people understand the threat which brings this organization and their followers to the prosperity of the country that will try to take care of the region. This is the question that is very complicated for finding the solution. And I doubt that anyone in the world, especially the UN, can take control over this area with no military power, with no like very strict rules. I'm not sure that it's possible, because you know, I believe that everything starts with education. And when I see footage from a kindergarten, when children for some holiday are acting in a play where one of them are IDF soldiers and other are shahidim, like the martyrs, and the kids of the age of 3 or 4 are pretending to kill each other, are pretending to be martyr shahids, and they pretend that this is a very, very, very cool thing. I'm not sure that this is what should be taught for kids in the age of 3. And I believe that the next power in Gaza should take much more efforts to educate people there, to show them the beauty of the world around, to show how they can interact with their neighbors. Because I saw the video that was shown by the Israeli army with the old footage for 44 minutes of mass killings of Israelis and foreigners on the 7th of October. And I've seen how like civilians in the Gaza Strip were humiliating the bodies of the Israeli soldiers and civilians brought there on the Hamas trucks. And they were like usual people that were spreading candies around the Gaza Strip and celebrating the attack of Hamas on the people, the same people as there are the same people from the both sides of the border, with the same color of blood, with the same love to the nature. I don't know, but the Hamas did everything for creating a cult of death and shahada. They're willing to die for jihad. And this is a thing that actually makes a huge difference between people from both sides of the fence.
So, Ilya, thank you very much for taking time for this conversation. I'm Ilya Aizenstat, activist of Israeli Friends of Ukraine organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Let's continue our show. During the ministerial meeting in Tokyo, the countries of the Group of 7 also focused on the issue of support for Ukraine. They agreed on 4 areas of effort necessary to strengthen its defense capability, economic stability, and speed up European integration. As stated by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, several things must be done at the same time.
Today, we also focused on our enduring support for Ukraine. The G7 has led the world in galvanizing and sustaining that support. And as we told Foreign Minister Kuleba today, Ukraine can count on us. To put Ukraine on a solid foundation for the next year, we must help Ukraine do 4 things at once.
So first, according to Blinken, it is necessary to provide Ukraine with opportunities to continue its struggle and regain its territory. The second direction is to help create a world-class armed forces. This is necessary, I quote, to ensure maximum deterrence in the long term and to make it clear to the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, that he cannot and will not survive Ukraine, and also cannot and will not survive all those who support Ukraine. In this context, Blinken reminded that many countries have undertaken quite specific commitments to help Ukraine rebuild the armed forces of the future. The third point of work is the start of economic recovery and growth. It is necessary to create more hope and opportunities for Ukrainians, he added. In addition, it is necessary to speed up the reform process in order to speed up Ukraine's path to the European Union and attract investments. This was the fourth point. The joint document of the G7 countries states that their commitment to supporting Ukraine's struggle for its independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity will never waver. The countries reiterated that they are committed to supporting Ukraine as long as necessary, while increasing economic pressure and imposing tough sanctions and other restrictions against Russia. A just and durable peace cannot be realized without the immediate, complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops and military equipment from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, the document states. And the countries of Group of 7 once again emphasized that any use of chemical, biological or nuclear weapons by Russia would have serious consequences. They continue to coordinate on sanctions to limit Russia's access to critical goods and technologies. In addition, the world's leading countries called on third parties to immediately stop providing material support for Russia's aggression. And Russia must pay for its actions in Ukraine, the G7 document says. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Yoko Kamikawa, separately noted that her country has announced and it's currently implementing aid to Ukraine in the total amount of $7.6 billion. Tokyo also plans to hold a Japanese-Ukrainian conference on promoting economic recovery at the beginning of next year.
It is continuously our priority as the G7 to stop Russia's invasion as soon as possible. We will continue to support Ukraine as necessary as possible in various fields, including diplomacy, humanitarian aid, finance, and security.
Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, joined the conversation online. He thanked the G7 countries for supporting Ukraine in the fight against Russian aggression and noted the priority importance of joint work for the further promotion of the Ukrainian peace formula. He also drew the attention of his colleagues to the priority of further military support to Ukraine and increasing the volume of joint production of weapons and ammunition. The minister recalled the International Defense and Industrial Forum held in Ukraine in September, which was attended by 252 leading defense companies from more than 30 countries of the world, and urged the interlocutors to actively encourage the defense enterprise of their countries to cooperate with Ukrainian partners and joint defense production. Later, in a telephone conversation, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida assured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of continued support for his country from the G7 and Japan despite the Middle East conflict. Kishida also announced plans to hold a Japanese-Ukraine conference on economics and reconstruction in February. Separately, Japanese Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa said that the G7 foreign ministers strongly condemned the repeat launches of ballistic missiles by North Korea, as well as the supply for weapons from North Korea to Russia, which directly violate the relevant resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. Let's discuss all this in more detail with my guest. And I'm pleased to introduce you my next guest. This is Oleksandr Merezhko, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, head of the Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Relations. relations. So, Mr. Merezhko, nice to see you and to hear you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's a pleasure. So, my first question. Was enough attention paid to Ukraine at the summit compared to other aspects of agenda? Primarily if we are talking about the events in the Middle East.
Well, first of all, let me remind the audience that we're talking about meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs in Tokyo. The document which was issued as a result of this meeting, of these negotiations, is a statement. And there are three major points included in this statement. And the point regarding Ukraine, which is called Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, it's number 2 point. So it illustrates that for G7, for its ministers of foreign affairs, the issue of Ukraine, the issue of Russian aggression against Ukraine remains one of the top priorities. And to me, it indicates or illustrates that G7 continues to support Ukraine and continues to do everything possible to provide necessary aid to Ukraine.
Yes, and for you, what was the main message for Ukraine? The main message? It's, of course, everybody understands that this is a common phrase, which I think it's time to a little bit paraphrase, like, we will be with Ukraine as long as it needs. Maybe it's time to paraphrase it in a way, we will provide Ukraine with everything it needs to win this war, isn't it?
Well, actually, the wording of this statement made by the foreign ministers is very close to the formula which you have just mentioned. Well, it starts with the statement that G7 will continue its unwavering support of Ukraine, despite all the changes which are occurring right now in world relations. Despite this, Ukraine will be supported. And what is really important in this statement is the phrase according to which G7 is for lasting and just peace, by which they mean peace based on international law, and which should start with the immediate and total withdrawal of all Russian troops from the whole territory of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders. It's a strong statement. Another important statement is that the countries which are members of G7, they're determined to continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes. So it indicates that we continue to have all kinds of support of our reliable allies, of our friends.
Yes, of course, but this is one moment, one bit which I wanted to emphasize and underline what Josep Borrell said, that it can be in the near future that the help, the aid from the USA can be reduced, and the European country, the country of the European Union, should take their responsibility to provide Ukraine with more aid. What do you think? How do you commend this?
Well, first of all, I'm absolutely sure, and it was stated by President Biden many times, that under all circumstances, the US will continue providing necessary military, technical, and material aid to Ukraine. The aid will continue. At the same time, if, so to speak, worst comes to worst, the aid also will continue from the European Union. But I'm sure that both parties, United States and the countries which are member states of the European Union, will continue to support Ukraine.
What do you think? Can Ukraine rely on the decisions of the summit? Because it is not an international organization. It doesn't any charter, and the decisions are advisory.
Indeed, technically speaking, or from the perspective of international law, the decisions or statements made by G7 are not legally binding, but they carry considerable political and moral authority. These decisions sometimes may be even more effective and more reliable than certain international legal rules. These decisions are implemented, very strictly implemented. And that's why, from political perspective, this statement, this decision has tremendous importance. It's like a guidelines indicating in which direction the policy of the biggest countries in the world, democratic countries in the world, will proceed.
Are there any disputes within the G7 countries regarding support for Ukraine? Who are the supporter number one for Ukraine?
I don't see any kind of serious disputes regarding, for example, the issue of whether or not to continue support of Ukraine. Well, there might be some disputes related to nuances or to details, but these countries, these democratic countries, they are of the same opinion. They are like-minded, so to speak, countries. But of course, they have their leader, and the leader of the free world, of democratic world, it is the United States, of course. But at the same time, other countries also play a considerable role. Number two, in terms of economic and military aid to Ukraine now is Germany, for example. And other countries also tend to increase support of Ukraine. I mean Japan, I mean France, and other members of G7.
Which instrument, what do you think, is of an influence of the G7 countries against Russia is most effective?
One of the most effective instruments is, of course, a mechanism of sanctions. Economic sanctions, political sanctions, but I would also distinguish, I would also mention in this context other instruments like political pressure on Russia, like diplomatic isolation of Russia, and of course any kinds of material support of Ukraine also matter.
Mr. Merezhko, what do you think? What has changed in group since Russia left it in 2014?
I would say that the presence of Russia at that time, before this group was known as G8, when Russia was included, it was a mistake made by the free world, by democratic world, from the very beginning to include Russia. Because what unites these countries which are members of G7? Values, common values like freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And these values have always been alien to Russia. Russian presence in G8 was absolutely logical, absolutely absurd. And when Russia was expelled from this format, to me it was very right step, very logical step. And it led to further isolation of Russia, because Russia doesn't belong to the free world, and I doubt that it will ever become democratic state.
And what do you think, how does the Group of Seven contribute to Ukraine's economic development and support its reform?
It's difficult to overstate the importance of this support because, for instance, we've been talking about weaponry, contemporary weaponry, long-range weaponry. This aid, military, is provided by G7. But talking about the statement made by the foreign ministers, we shouldn't forget the part of it devoted specifically to reconstruction of Ukraine. It says that G7 will provide support for rebuilding of Ukrainian economy in the long term and in the short term and in the medium term also. Of course, it takes different forms. It takes form of direct material of financial aid. This aid can also be provided through international institutions like International Monetary Fund, for instance, and other international institutions. So G7 is vitally interested in helping Ukraine to survive economically, because we're talking here about war of attrition, which means that Russia, the aggressor, is trying to destroy our economy. And G7 understands this, and especially it sees what's going on right now, what can happen during the coming winter. They understand that Russia will continue to destroy our critical infrastructure, our power grid. And G7 is determined to provide the necessary aid to support our energy system.
Yes, it's very important for Ukraine to save and to reconstruct the energy system. So, Mr. Merezhko, thank you very much for your answers. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for taking time for our conversation. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our show, and I'm ready to continue it. And let's return to the topic of the war that is near us, which was started by Russia in the center of Europe. Despite the worsening of the situation in the Middle East, the world's attention to the war on the European continent will not decrease. This was emphasized by the G7 countries at the last meeting in Tokyo and in separate statements by most of the world leaders.
We have many problems that will be a test for the EU. First of all, Ukraine, where the prospect of victory over Russia is not instantaneous. And we, the Europeans who have the necessary means for this, should be ready, speaking politically, to continue helping Ukraine.
In addition, the EU intends to present the 12th package of sanctions against Russia. In particular, it may refer to Russian diamonds. Germany plans to double military aid to Ukraine next year to 8 billion euros. This was reported by the Reuters agency with reference to its own sources. Nevertheless, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany also confirmed that Berlin will continue to support Ukraine and the amount of aid will be increased. Germany will generally increase its defense spending to 2.1% of the country's GDP. They will exceed the bar for minimum spending on relevant needs established for NATO member states.
Putin is rejoicing too soon in view of the dramatic situation worldwide, because we will not only continue our support for Ukraine, we will continue to expand and increase it, especially from the Federal Republic of Germany, not only with a view to the winter protective shield for the coming weeks and months, where it is clear that the Russian president will once again perfidiously exploit the needs of the people in the cold winter, but our support will also be massively expanded, especially for the next year.
French President Emmanuel Macron said in the interview with the BBC that it is the duty of his country and all countries to support Ukraine in its defense. However, he also noted that the next month will be crucial as Ukraine tries to regain lost ground during counteroffensive operations. In addition, Macron believes that if the Russian Federation is allowed to win the war against Ukraine, then a new imperial state will appear in Europe, which can threaten other former Soviet republics and the entire continent. Prime Minister of Great Britain, Rishi Sunak, assured that the British people will be with Ukraine until victory and will support it to become a safe, prosperous European democracy. Japanese ambassador to Ukraine Matsuda Kuninori said that more than 600 days after the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Japanese Prime Minister's policy of providing assistance to Ukraine is still very high. Tokyo will send $7.6 billion to Kyiv in several priority directions, which primarily include demining and debris removal. The second priority, as the ambassador noted, is the restoration and reconstruction of the basis infrastructure, including, in particular, the energy sector. The third direction, according to Kuninori, is related to the support of the Ukrainian agri-industrial complex. The US President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, called on Congress to adopt a new large-scale support package for Ukraine. According to him, the government is actively working with Republicans and Democrats in both houses of the US Congress.
The Biden administration put forward a funding request for Israel, for Ukraine, for the Indo-Pacific, and for the border. We detailed exactly what we needed, including for Ukraine, and we still need that, and we need it as soon as we can get it. And we are working actively with both the House and the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, to secure the votes and to get the vote to get that funding. And I continue to remain confident that while this has been a winding road since we began the effort to secure additional funding for Ukraine, that there is a strong bipartisan majority in both houses to do it, and we will ultimately get it done. How exactly, through what vehicle and what measure, that's something that I will defer to the legislative experts on. I will only say that we are continuing to make the case actively. I'm on the phone personally daily with members, both Democrats and Republicans, to make the case. And we are leaning forward in making it clear that the United States' national interest will be deeply harmed if we are not able to secure and sustain funding for Israel, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, and the border.
Watch this.
And I'm ready and pleased to introduce my guest, Iliya Kusa, expert on international policy of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future.
Watch this.
Let me start with the phrase which every Ukrainian knows. We will support Ukraine. We will be with Ukraine as much, as long as it's necessary. Isn't it time to rephrase this phrase in like, we will provide Ukraine with everything it needs to win this war?
I mean, it's a question to who should do that. I don't think, who should rephrase it, because we hear this, we hear it from our Western partners, including the United States. And I think when they say that we're going to support Ukraine as long as necessary, I guess that what they mean is that, they are ready to support us long term, but I'm not sure that they are ready to say that they are going to give us exactly everything, because, first of all, it's just logic. You cannot promise something that you don't have, because we all know, and it's no secret that European countries are struggling to provide Ukraine with all weapons that we need.
Because they don't have enough.
Because they don't have enough, and because they were not ready for...
Or maybe because Ukraine doesn't know about the quantity of the weapon they have.
Even if we know, I mean, the war on such scale it's something that the world and Europe hasn't seen since the end of the Second World War, and they are not ready for that. So of course they cannot say that we will provide everything that you need, because they understand their limits and their limitations.
Why I'm asking you, because I think that this phrase has already turned into symbolic one.
It is. I mean, it has always been political and symbolic, but this phrase still, I think it's more accurate than the one that you think should be rephrased to, we will, because if it's better this way than if they say that we're going to give you everything you need, but then they will not do that, and they will break their promise.
Yeah. We're talking about meeting, G7 meeting, which was recently, and what do you think? Can Ukraine rely on the decisions of this meeting, because it's not an international organization. They have not, it hasn't even a charter, and all decisions are advisory.
Yes, it is a sort of political club that was created, I guess, in the context of the Cold War by the countries that are often called the West. It's the United States and their allies. At some point, Russia was the member of G7, but it was more like it is more a situational thing than ad hoc thing than a long-term commitment, as we saw. Because It was not long when Russia started to, pose a challenge to the United States and their allies, and so they kicked Russia out of G7. But still, even if it is a political club with advisory consultation functions, those negotiations that happen, on this platform, they have a very, I think that they are very important as, for coordination of our Western partners' efforts in supporting us. So, I mean, in a way, yes, this is one of many formats that our Western partners have where they can negotiate what their strategy and coordinate their, decisions, their actions that they take in order to support Ukraine. So I would say that Ukraine can rely on such platforms, but of course, this is only G7 is not, because there is this I think a misleading notion, perception in Ukraine of G7 as some kind of a world global summit, that have the power to make decisions on a global scale, which is not the case, because G7 is, as I said, is a political club which unites mainly, the so-called Western countries. But for example, but we cannot perceive G7 as a global platform that, for example, can affect such non-Western regions, non-Western countries and partners that we also need, such as China, India, Pakistan. They cannot involve them. So I would say that Ukraine can rely on G7 in that part, in the part which is related to our Western partners' strategy in supporting Ukraine. But if we're talking about more global politics, no, it's not the case.
What do you think? What has changed in this group of G7 countries after Russia was kicked off? And we remember then Donald Trump, the ex-president of the United States, it was attempt. He tried to bring Russia back, but the other countries refused.
Yeah.
And what has changed in this group since the Russia left?
Well, basically nothing, because as I said, Russia's accession to G7, when it became G8, it was, it was an ad hoc decision to grant Russia some kind of world status in order to bring them closer to Western countries. Because at the time when this decision was made, these were times when the idea of Russia, I mean, the perception of Russia was very different from today's. So we need to remember that these were times when many European countries and some, I would say that some American leaders as well, considered Russia as a partner, a long-term partner.
And still, some of them
today it's
consider them as a partner.
Some of them, but it's more, today it's a marginalized idea. Today, it's not very popular to say something like that. But back then, I mean, it was an idea which everyone believed in. That they thought that Russia is their partner in Eastern Europe, which would help them build some kind, of a stable security architecture in Eurasia. And when Russia's membership in G7, its accession in G7 club, was payment to Russia for, they thought that if we integrate Russia closer into Western-led structures like G7, like NATO, you remember when there was Russia-NATO Council created, and I think they canceled it. They canceled this format only last year, if I remember right. So yeah, this all was part of this idea that we need to integrate Russia. We need to work together with Russia on setting up a new security architecture in Eurasia. Now it's gone, and so I would say that this idea is dead. I don't believe that Russia is going to return to G7 in any capacity in future. Because first of all, as I said, this is a marginalized idea. It's not very, it's unpopular. And secondly, I don't think Russia is interested anymore, because they think of themselves that the West is their enemy. And since the West is their enemy, they cannot be integrated into Western-led structures.
If we look at each of these countries from which consists this G7 group, what do you think? Are there any disputes within these countries regarding the support for Ukraine? Who is Ukrainians' biggest and closest friend, if we might say?
I would say the United States and Western European, and EU countries. So EU and NATO, these are the biggest donors and partners of Ukraine in the context of this war. Of course, there are certain differences between them in terms of how they perceive Russia's threat, how they see Russia, in future. Like, for example, if you take Poland or Romania or Baltic states, they mainly see Russia as a long-term military and political threat, no matter how this war will end. While in the United States, I think that there are different views on Russia, including people that still think that Russia can be integrated as a partner, after this war. So they believe, for example, there are countries in Western Europe that believe that Russia is capable of that democratization of Russia is something. They
believe in this process.
Yeah, they believe in this. They think that this is something that we just need to wait, that this will happen. And after this happens, we can return to normal dialogue with Russia. While other countries like Poland, they don't believe it. So I think that there are certain differences, of course, which is normal because these are different countries, different political elites, different interests, different perceptions. And this is all about perceptions, history, something like that.
Let me ask you about the head of the European Union diplomacy, Josep Borrell. He was a participant on the G7 meeting, and he said that European Union countries should be politically ready to continue supporting Ukraine against the background of the events in the Middle East, especially if the support from the USA is reduced. Do you think, are they ready, European countries?
That's a good question because, I think politically, he said politically, yes. I think politically they are ready to continue supporting Ukraine. I don't see any upcoming changes in that position. And now economically and financially, militarily, I think the European Union is, as I said, is limited.
It looks like the USA, like Ukrainians' biggest supporter and ally, is just trying to replace the responsibility for this war in Ukraine for the European Union.
I think this is my understanding of what European politicians are afraid of, because they all try to see and try to understand what is going on in the United States and whether the United States will be ready to continue supporting Ukraine at the same level as it has been for the last almost 2 years. So I think the European Union is ready to support Ukraine, but they have their own limitations. They have limits in their capacities. And of course, if the United States, everything will depend, it also will depend on who is going to win American elections next year. Because if it's going to be, for example, Trump, I think he and his fellow Republicans will try to convince the EU countries to give Ukraine more, so that to reduce their own support. And this is something that the European Union is trying to think ahead of how they can do that without
adjust this situation.
Without alienating their own social base, their own support base in the European countries, because they have also their own elections, their own people, their own interests. And so, of course, they don't want to, for example, find themselves in a situation where they have to pay too much.
It's like warming up exercise,
Yeah, I think that's why Josep Borrell brought up, this question on G7 summit. Again, as I told you, the G7 summit is a perfect opportunity to speak about this in order, between different countries of the so-called collective West.
So, Ilya, it was nice to talk with you. It's a great pleasure for me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking your time and come to our studio. So, in dollars and euros, political coalition or the fate of ordinary people, how is the value of the victory that Ukraine is fighting for measured? while the question is rhetorical. But it all has meaning, and every day brings the war closer to completion in the democratic world. Fight together. Take care and see you soon.